I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council, Foothills, for having me and feeding me and my wife and my daughter and my son-in-law. This is my family feeding program. I come to this. No, my daughter Kristen and her husband Glenn Wallace live here in Evergreen, and thank you for hosting them as well. I would like to thank you for having Larry Diamond as your speaker last month, because a couple of members of my department saw this online. They said, "You're speaking at the same place as Larry Diamond? He's a big deal." So I am not a big deal, but I have become a big deal by association around the department because I speak to the World Affairs Council, the Foothills World Affairs Council. So thank you for that as well. My love affair with Turkey goes back to, in 1967, my father was sent to Ankara. He was in the Air Force, and I spent my first 2 years of high school in Ankara, in Turkey. I, of course, didn't want to go in the 8th grade and didn't want to leave, but it was an incredible experience. And about 5 years ago, I shifted my research agenda. Used to be a Soviet guy. Amazing how that went away, although there's a resurgence in that. I may have to shift back. But I moved to the Middle East, and I kind of realigned my international interest with Turkey with my research interest. So you are the victims of that now. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is, as we mentioned with some reference to Stanley Kubrick, Turkey is this country that sits astride Europe and Asia geographically, but it sits astride Europe and Asia politically. It sits astride Europe and Asia culturally. Erdogan is the current prime minister that we'll talk about. Is looking east, he's looking west, he's looking authoritarian, he's looking democratic. Which way is it headed? And I don't pretend to be able to give you a final answer on that, but I hope I can give you some information. A little bit of balance between background, for those of you that don't have it, and my apologies for those of you that already have the background, and then a little bit on what's going on now. My wife and I have made 5 trips in the last 4 years, and we spend every summer there. And we were the victims of tear gas last summer. I teach revolution at University of Colorado. I have much more credibility now because I had never been tear gassed before. I somehow missed that in the 60s because I was in Turkey. So, now I can say I've experienced it. So if you want to know any questions, it's just like a lot of cigarette smoke early on until you really get hit. So for those of you that know, these are all pictures of Gazi Mustafa Kemal Pasha, better known as Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey. And his image around Turkey is omnipresent. It's ubiquitous. You can't go anywhere without seeing a picture of Ataturk. He created kind of a cult of personality around himself, which has been perpetuated in the Turkish Republic. But that said, this benevolent dictatorship that he started and the democracy he created did wonders for Turkey. I mean, it moved Turkey from east to west, leaving behind the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and moved Turkey into the 20th century. Now, the economic development out of the Third World is a more recent, but you could give credit that Turkish democracy largely belongs to Ataturk. Ataturk became famous by being a regimental commander in the Battle of Gallipoli, but kind of was too junior to get involved in the Young Turks movement that toppled the Sultan and was involved in the Armenian genocide or not genocide, depending on which side of the debate you're on. But he was there at the end of World War I. When Turkey was cut up, Turkey unfortunately joined the wrong side in World War I and was cut up by the Allies, by the Treaty of Sevres. It was occupied by the French, the Italians, the Greeks, and the British, who were all tending to cut up a piece of Turkey. And Ataturk almost single-handedly, with his ability to play the Allies off against each other, as well as Turks off against each other, as well as defeat the Greeks militarily, cobbled together the Turkish Republic in what is together Anatolia. And there is a cult of personality around him, but he truly is a hero. I mean, he is a remarkable man to create a Turkish Republic out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. And what he did to move Turkey forward is absolutely amazing if you don't know. I mean, he, by edict, outlawed the fez, outlawed headscarves in public buildings, public schools, and in parliament. He changed the Turkish alphabet from the Arabic script to the Roman alphabet. He created at that time kind of a one-party democracy, but throughout his kind of benevolent dictatorship, he would say, he would go to one of his advisors, go out and create an opposition party. And then when they'd get out of hand, he'd rein them in, and then he'd send someone else out to make an opposition party. It really wasn't until after his death that his successor, Ishmet Inanu, really created a multi-party democracy. But I kind of think we're learning that in political science that new democracies are the most dangerous states in the world. And if you could trust them to a benevolent dictatorship for a short period of time, while institutions gain legitimacy, while the economy gains legitimacy, they're much better off. And to some degree, that is what Ataturk did in Turkey. And even among Islamists, yes, he created a constitution that separates church and state. Turkey is 98% Muslim, mostly Sunni, some Shia, Alevis and Druze, and Salafis, but largely Sunni. Most of them aren't radically fundamentalist, but they are Muslim. But he created a constitution that separates church and state. And to many, that's one of the elements that moved Turkey forward. Now that could be debated. But his legacy is a very important one, and all pieces of the political spectrum in Turkey tried to grab that piece of Ataturk, that they, are the heirs to Ataturk in running the Turkish Republic. The military, from which he came, kind of became the institution that was the protector of Ataturk's secular republic. And the military stepped in kind of like every 10 years they did this. Kind of like 60, 70, and 80, they stepped in. But it's very different than the Latin American military coups or the sub-Saharan African. These weren't generals and admirals that, they didn't take off their uniforms, put on a suit and said, I'm the president. They would step in, they would kick a party out on the right that was too Islamist, they would kick a party out on the left that was Marxist. They'd step 3 months later, they'd kind of step back and say, okay, go at it again. And the election process would continue. Some, again, the European Union looked askance. We in the West look at military stepping in. That's not particularly democratic. But among the Turkish citizenry, there's still a majority who believe that the Turkish military is that protector that maintains Ataturk's legacy and Ataturk's constitution. This man is revered by some, and to others he is ultimately the Führer, the Sultan, you name it. He is a very divisive figure. He is the current Prime Minister of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. G's with little hats are silent. Okay? And as you can see, that's the Economist cover there on the lower right. We call it Sultan Tayyip. He's been ultimately described as mildly Islamist. That's like sort of pregnant. He is. Some believe that the pendulum swung too far to the secular, denying, it's what we call aggressive secularism. To some, that denies them the ability to practice Islam. But to others, again, he has this creeping Islamism, is challenging the Republic of Turkey. That picture on the left with Erdogan and President Obama and Michelle, and that's Erdogan's wife. That is a remarkable picture because this is the first Turkish First Lady, Prime Minister, or President to ever wear a headscarf. At the reception, every year on Turkish Republic Day, where all of the Turkish military and governmental leaders meet, the military refused to go through the receiving line because she was there in a headscarf. Now, to some, this is religious freedom. To others, it's creeping Islamism. Some, it's the idea that a woman should be able to dress however she wants, practice her religion or not. To others, it is representative of a state that, to some, this is like sticking a knife in Ataturk's heart, that challenges that secular republic. A little background. I was kind of thinking, what can I do to kind of place Turkey in the world in a broader context before we talk about the current problems, the current issues. And I kind of think the debate, I chose the debate over Turkey joining the EU as a kind of a good summary of kind of all of the issues surrounding Turkey's place in the world today. And we can just walk through these quickly. For example, starting at the top, Turkey has a population of about 81 million. Germany has a population of about 81 million. Germany is the largest state in the European Union. If you know the voting in the European Commission, which is the quasi-executive legislative branch of the European Union, is done by this qualified majority. If Turkey is admitted to the European Union, and with the birth rate in Turkey, which is about twice what it is in Germany, Turkey will pretty soon be the largest voting bloc in the European Union, which to some is a reason right there not to have Turkey in the European Union. Turkey is a long-standing original NATO member, also a member of CENTO, the kind of the treaty organization under the southern part of Russia. Turkey was a loyal NATO ally throughout the Cold War. Numbers of American bases, including my father, were stationed there during the Cold War. And they are the only European NATO member who was not offered a chance to join the European Union. Norway is NATO, chose not to join the European Union. But every other NATO member in Europe is a member but Turkey. And NATO kind of acts as the military arm of the European Union, so some people believe it's wrong that Turkey is not a member, and should be. The Kurdish issue, though, is one that has always been a stumbling block, because Kurds are the largest minority. They are Sunni Muslim, but they're not Turks. They're not Arabs either, they're Kurds. And as you know, Kurds are the largest single group of people in the world today that really don't have a state. Kurds live in southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, northwestern Iraq, and western Iran. And under previous governments of Turkey, the crackdown on Kurds and their human rights has been a sticking, and the European Union looked askance at the way the Turks, and particularly the military, treated the Kurdish minority. The military arm of the Kurdish minority, the Kurdish Workers' Party, has fought a 30-year separatist campaign with over 40,000 people have died. But Erdogan, interestingly enough, over the last 10 years, has allowed Kurdish to be taught in the schools. He has allowed, you can come to court now and plead your case in the Kurdish language. There are now radio stations in southeastern Turkey that broadcast in Kurdish. And most recently, he has conducted a ceasefire with Ahmet Öcalan, who's the head of the PKK, in prison, but still leading the PKK from a Turkish prison. He has negotiated a ceasefire which has moved all PKK fighters from Turkey into northern Iraq. So from at least from the European Union standpoint regarding Kurds, this has been a very good thing. This is with regard to a human rights issue inside of Turkey. I already mentioned civil-military relations, in that the military has stepped in 3 times, almost 4, in Turkey. But Erdogan defanged the military. One of our friends, who's a retired admiral, Turkish Naval Academy graduate, there were 7 admirals in his class at the Turkish Naval Academy. He's the only one that's not in jail. Now, some of these charges, opponents believe these were trumped up by the Erdogan government. But suffice to say, he has put 250 either retired or active duty generals or admirals in jail on the charges being that they were about to effect another coup. Regardless whether these charges are true or not, he has defanged the military. Now, to some who believe that the military stepping in was not a good thing for Turkish democracy, it makes Erdogan look like he's doing the right thing. To some believe that that was the protector against creeping Islamism, he's done the wrong thing in that regard. I mentioned this briefly, it's another issue with the EU, is that I told you there are about 81 million Turks and 81 million Germans. Of those 81 million Germans, 6 million are Turks. Either Turks or have one Turkish parent. And they are not German citizens. They are Gastarbeiter, they are guest workers. If Turkey enters the EU, guess what happens to those 6 million Turks? They become German citizens. Become a very significant voting bloc in German politics. Mary and I were in Berlin, where is the largest concentration of Turks outside of Turkey. There are 1 million Turks in Berlin. You can get around the town pretty well in Turkish, not just in German. So that's another significant issue regarding Turkish admission. A very major one, of course, is Cyprus. And I would love to come back and just talk about the Cyprus issue. Because in 1974, I did an exchange cruise as a midshipman with the Turkish Navy, and got to see the invasion of Cyprus up close and personal from a Turkish destroyer. And that issue today, the chief state that is vetoing Turkish admission to the EU is not Greece, it's Cyprus. because Turkey has 20,000 troops and occupies the northern third of Cyprus, based on a coup that the Greek junta started in '74 to unite Cyprus with Greece. The Turks asked for British help and didn't get it. British were the guarantor of the treaty, long story. But the Turks intervened. Bülent Ecevit, the prime minister, landed the Turks and they took the northern third of the island, which they still hold today, 36 years later. And that's the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, is recognized by one state, Turkey. And it is continually, but there is no, Kofi Annan, when he left, his last thing as Secretary General of the UN was determined to solve the Cyprus crisis. He spent 8 months there getting all the parties together. He got a settlement, put it to referendum. The Turkish Cypriots voted for it, the Greek Cypriots voted against it, and Cyprus remains divided. Everybody thinks it's just North and South Korea. So Cyprus is still a major stumbling block in Turkish relations. Right now, immigration to the EU, the Greeks are kind of the front door from everyone coming from the Middle East into the EU. Greece, actually, traditional enemies of Turkey, but NATO allies would love to have Turkey in, because then guess who becomes the front door to the EU? It now becomes a Turkish responsibility instead of a Greek responsibility. They would love to have them there. The bottom one, if you can't quite see it, is this issue of Islam. Some believe that the EU is kind of a Christian club. And there are some more xenophobic right-wing parties, you name it, throughout Europe, who are anti-Turkey joining the EU because of that issue, the issue of Islam. But to others, they are a little afraid of what they see as what's happening in Turkey right now. A movement away from democracy, a movement toward a more authoritarian regime, exemplified by our friend Mr. Erdogan. Mr. Erdogan is the head of the AKP, which is an acronym for Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, which is the Justice and Development Party. I'm only telling you this because the acronym becomes important, because they like to call themselves the AK Party. And AK is this kind of word that means white or pure, implying that they're kind of above corruption. Rather, where their opponents call them the AK Party, they like to be called the AK Party. He has been elected 3 times in free and fair elections with a larger amount each time. Something in the vicinity of about 35 to 42 to 49 in the most recent election. And now, those of you that have been to Turkey, if you've been in Izmir, Ankara, Istanbul, and you've been talking to business owners and educated elite and members of the military, it's tough to find an Erdogan supporter. Few cab drivers. But if you get out in the countryside, where they're a little more conservative, he is very, very popular. I mean, in the circles you kind of run in Istanbul, it's very difficult to figure out how he got 49% of the vote. But he does. And he speaks a very, to people that speak Turkish better than me have told me that he speaks a very kind of base, low-class Turkish. But it has a very populist, whether he's very shrewd or that's just the way he talks, it has a great deal of populist appeal. He doesn't speak like an educated Turk. He kind of speaks like a country bumpkin would be, but that doesn't quite translate very well into Turkish. But more importantly than that is what Turkey has done economically. Are you familiar with, we talk about the BRICS, kind of these, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They've got to figure out a way to add a T to that acronym. I don't know, TUBRICS? BRICS? Because Turkey has grown 5% a year since Erdogan was elected. The per capita GDP has gone from $2,300 a month, or $2,300 a year, to up to $18,000 a year. I mean, they are really a middle-class country now. People have cars. If you've seen the traffic in Istanbul, you know they have cars. I mean, people are all going to college. I mean, this is a country on the move. Their unemployment is about par to ours, which for a country in that region is very, very low. And they're not people sitting on a corner anymore playing tabla, which is what they call backgammon. Back in the days when I was 60, they were drinking tea and playing backgammon all day. They're working now, and they're making a lot of money. There's Dolce & Gabbana and Ferraris in there. Istanbul is a city with a lot of money. They're building ships, they're building cars. This is not a third world country anymore. So you've got to try to gauge, where does Erdogan's support come from? The people on the left, the secular elite, aren't going to vote for him no matter what. The people, more Islamist conservatives on the right, are going to vote for him no matter what. But the people in the middle, we kind of think that's because of the economy. quote Carville, it's the economy stupid. As long as the economy continues to grow, I think Erdogan will continue to get that kind of support. Many people looked at Turkey is truly the only Islamic multi-party democracy in the Middle East. And this is a quote from a Turkish parliamentarian in the opposition party, that the idea that somehow these Arab Spring states were looking to Turkey as a model for an Islamist democracy. Broken heads, tear gas, water cannon, it must be Cairo, Tripoli, and some other capital of a brutal dictatorship. If this is Taksim Square, this is in Istanbul, not Tahrir Square. So I want to tell you a little bit about last summer as kind of a case study, as a microcosm of kind of what this regime is doing and how democracy is being challenged, possibly. You kind of draw your own conclusions. This is a very famous photo. I didn't take this one, but there's lots of on here that I did take. This woman kind of became symbolic of the harsh crackdown of peaceful demonstrations last summer in Istanbul. This young woman was merely walking across Taksim Square, and if you've been to Turkey, you know that there are women in headscarves, and then there are women in high heels and miniskirts and long blonde hair, and she was walking across, and she got hit by this is a mixture of pepper spray and tear gas that they put out in massive volumes to peaceful protesters throughout last June. Sometimes fired out of a gun, but very often put out of this spray gun. So on May the 28th of last summer, 50 environmentalists were camping in Istanbul's Gezi Park. Now I'll show you on a map on the next slide kind of what Gezi Park. Gezi Park is this last little bit of green space, probably about 3 or 4 acres next door to Taksim Square. Taksim Square is kind of Times Square of Istanbul. It's a very famous four-sided statue of Ataturk. Ataturk, the statesman, the scholar, the soldier, and the president. And it's kind of where, if you're going to demonstrate, but there was this little piece of green. So this small group of environmentalists, because Erdogan was going to take out these old sycamore trees and put a shopping mall there, replica of an Ottoman military barracks. Now, Istanbul is a large city. We now believe the largest city in the world. Inhales and exhales about 1 million people every day. They have 179 enclosed shopping malls. Now, I don't care how big the city is. Most people you talk to in Istanbul say the last thing we need is another shopping mall. But development, he's all about development. So what you see there is this, on top is an aerial view of Taksim Square. And if you'll forgive me, I will. This is the four-sided statue of Ataturk. This is kind of where the buses are. That's Gezi Park, the small green space. This is going to be the Ottoman barracks that looks like a shopping center that looks like a barracks. It's going to be there. All the buses and cars are going to go underground. This is the Marmara Hotel. But very central. But with this advent of social media, just like with the Arab Spring, word got out that the bulldozers were there, and the crowd expanded from about 50 to about 1,000. The governor of Istanbul, who is a loyal AKP supporter of Erdogan's, sent in about 1,000 police with rubber bullets and tear gas and water cannons, and they were doing nothing other than standing in the park. And this brutal crackdown was covered by Reuters and international news, and really received a great deal of attention. And I took three of the 4 pictures there. This was an incredible crackdown. They were not blocking streets. They were just in the park. But this brings us to this point, is this just about the trees? It appears we now know that a great deal of the development in Istanbul bypasses environmental regulations, is bypassing. You dig a shovel anywhere in Istanbul, you hit something Byzantine or Roman, or you can't dig. And there are all sorts of regulations about how long you have to excavate and let the archaeologists in before you can. Well, it appears there have been a number of kickbacks that have avoided that. And it appears that Erdogan and many of his cronies have been getting very rich, at least if you believe the opposition, over some of this development. Large swaths of a neighborhood called Fatih, over in the old area by the Süleymaniye Mosque, where these old, beautiful wooden mansions are being scraped to build high-rises, to build, and all of the laws that exist to protect these neighborhoods are being bypassed. And this, little patch of trees becomes symbolic of a much more larger symbol of maybe some corrupt kind of development. He wants to build a third Bosphorus bridge. He wants to build the largest airport in the world. He wants to build a canal because the Bosphorus isn't big enough. I mean, this is kind of thing that's ongoing. The day of the big crackdown, this piece of graffiti here on the left of the penguin with the gas mask, is because Turkish media, during the first crackdown for the first day and a half, while Reuters was showing it, Turkish media was showing a Discovery Channel documentary on penguins all day, over and over and over again. So it became one of the symbols of the protesters. The media, particularly the state media, then became a target. Largely, the protesters did not do a whole lot of property destruction. We'll talk about where they built barricades. But one particular target of the protesters was media vehicles. And you can see the two media vehicles at the top are right there at Taksim Square. These were representative of the state media. The graffiti, without telling you, you'll learn your first Turkish word. In Turkey, you don't have an F-bomb, you had an S-bomb, okay? So you know what the graffiti on the bottom means. The media did not come out of this very well. Erdogan has basically, most of the major newspapers and television stations are in the pockets, and many mainstream media people have been fired and are now blogging, though, which is really interesting. These people who have been retired now become new media people in opposition to Erdogan. So there's a great deal of international hue and cry over this crackdown, over the small number of protesters just trying to protect trees from bulldozers. Erdogan, meanwhile, leaves the country. He goes to Tunisia on a state visit. The police kind of withdraw from Taksim. This is Taksim Square with Gezi Park in the back. The protesters expand beyond the park and take over the whole square. So all the buses and taxis. You can't even cross the street in Taksim Square on a regular day because it's so nuts. So for 10 days, Taksim Square becomes a festival. It was wonderful. There was no traffic. I mean, the protesters expanded beyond the park. They came out. Estimates on any given day was 15,000 to 20,000. It grew every night because every night there was a concert. You can see in the lower left, for those of you who see around the podium, people donated books. They set up a library in the park. In the upper right is this incredible, he's a very famous Turkish pianist. And on 4 of the days of the 10, they brought his grand piano in on a truck. He set it up in the square, and you can see he would play 3 or 4 hours at a time. And this day it's raining, and they're holding the umbrellas over his piano. In the lower right, yoga class in the park. And the center, that's a Starbucks, and what it says is ilk yardım, that means first aid. The Starbucks there on Taksim refused to give safe haven for people that got hit by tear gas on the square, so the protesters took over the Starbucks. And they made it their first aid thing. That's where you got your milk to put in your eyes, and first aid, and all of that. It really did become kind of every night. In my language class, a lot of young women who had married to Turks, their husbands every night after work would go to the park. The park would swell every night. Lawyers and doctors. This was not just, it was young people. It was not just students. This was doctors and lawyers. Erdogan, when he got back, called them all Çapulcu. Çapulcu is this Turkish term that's kind of looters and riffraff and vandals. So kind of to make light or to capture, to steal the vocabulary from the opposition became the badge of honor. We are all Çapulcu. And then of course that became t-shirts with stay calm and keep Çapule turned into a verb. We are all Çapuling. And I have a t-shirt that says every day I'm Çapuling. I had to ask my daughter about the song Every Day I'm Shuffling. It's a popular song, trust me. You may not know it. But they made it into Every Day I'm Çapuling. This, again, and you go down there, they're selling your Guy Fawkes mask, they're selling Turkish flags, it's like Disneyland. Meanwhile, I guess protesters always have to have something to do. So most Turkish streets and sidewalks are brick pavers. And this happens everywhere. Within about a square mile, of Taksim Square, they ripped up every single paver you could find. They took every planter, they took every police barricade, they took all of those media vehicles they had burned, and they built these barricades all around Taksim Square. At varying, and on some streets, a series of barricades, 4 or 5 strong. You know, I guess you got to believe a concerted police effort with trucks and bulldozers, you know, probably, but I guess I say it gives protesters something to do, and it also allows them something to hide behind when the tear gas is coming. But literally, they tore up, you know, I don't know how many millions of pavers and tore up, but these barricades, these are all, this one, the lower left-hand corner, that building on the left is where my school was. That's where my language school is, right by one of these barricades about 2 blocks from Taksim. And the amount of gas, the graffiti, you see the Kimisal Tayyip, which is chemical Tayyip, or they called him the Red Hot Chili Erdogan, or the Gas Father. He actually ran out, and the first thing, he ran out of tear gas. They had to import it, because this was now spreading to other cities. They had to import it from everywhere else. So at dawn on the 11th of June, meanwhile, Erdogan gave the protesters a 48-hour, they didn't have to abandon the park, but they had to abandon the square so that traffic could return. And he gave them a 48-hour notice to abandon the square. 24 hours later, 24 hours prior to his ultimatum, 5,000 troops, 14 trucks with water cannons, at 7:30 in the morning, assaulted the square. Bulldozers over the barricades. Mary and I, that's when we were walking through the square on our way that morning. It was worse than you can imagine, because these weren't all protesters. These were people going to work, and little old ladies and children. And there was literally no discrimination. I mean, tear gas fired in the gun variety, the truck variety, the pepper spray. And let me show you I'll show you, I'll go back up. These are scenes, the violence went on for 4 days when they recaptured the square. And every night, it was inspiring, though, for me. I mean, you could say, you know, youthful idealism, but young people would form up about a mile away every night. They'd have their gas mask, their swim goggles, they'd have their helmet on, they had their milk bottle, you know, for the tear gas, and they would go try to retake the square peacefully, to march in the square. And then every night, the police would move further and further out from Taksim. We lived a mile and a half from Taksim Square. We had 200 police down firing gas below our apartment, down below there. I mean, this was larger than you could imagine for this type of thing. The governor of Istanbul, after promising, well, you could stay in the park, we just want you out of the square. On the 15th of June, they came in again, this time about 2,000 police into the park, tore down all the tents, tore down everybody, and you can get an idea of what the tear gas was like and the rubber bullets in the square. This is a picture taken from the gym in the Marmara Hotel, giving you some idea of the extent of the tear gas across Taksim Square. Ultimately, 7 people died. I mean, the death of one is a tragedy. The death of no, it's not 60 that are dying in Iraq every day, but this is Turkey. This is this peaceful democracy. 7 people died and 1 police officer during this time. Ultimately, police recaptured the square. After 4 days of the students and young people trying to recapture the square, a calm kind of ensued. This building is another kind of important building on the left. This is the Ataturk Cultural Center, which is kind of the Ataturk's vestiges of kind of Western. It's where the symphony plays, okay? And for Erdogan, it's kind of this symbol of, he wants to put a mosque there. Now, if Istanbul certainly doesn't need another shopping center, guess what else they don't need? They don't need another mosque. I mean, I'm not belittling there are some devout Muslims and there's some who don't go to mosque. The great majority of Turks don't go to mosque or don't pray 5 times a day. But they respect their religion. But the idea, again, that this square is kind of a symbol, again, of secular Turkish Republic. To put a mosque where Ataturk Cultural Center is a very significant thing. You see on the left is at the height of the demonstrations, tributes to the martyrs, a sign that says, "Stop your crying, Tayyip." And on the right, after the police recaptured it, we see the portrait of Ataturk the Turkish flag there in back of the big water cannon vehicle. You know, everybody trying to capture again that image of Ataturk as symbolic of your side in the dispute. So they made a rule that no more than 14 people could assemble anywhere on Taksim Square, or you'd be arrested. So this is 2 days after kind of this return to normalcy. This man on the left is a cartoonist, and I saw him there that day. He showed up at 8 o'clock in the morning. He put his bag down, and he stared at the portrait of Ataturk and stayed there till dark. Stayed there for 12 hours. So the next day, they set it up so that groups of less than 14 people would come, and they would stand there all day, and they would stare at the picture of Ataturk to, again, continue their protest over the park. But as like all of these things, well, Erdogan says this will go away, well, you know, this will all die down. So this was last June and July. Now, starting about 3 months ago, starting in January, things began to heat up again. And maybe I should do this from bottom to top. This man in the bottom right-hand corner is Fethullah Gulen. Mr. Gulen is a former kind of ally of Erdogan. He's a devout Islamist, but he's also a businessman. And he and Erdogan were allies early on in bringing AKP to power. But it appears in the last 3 or 4 years they've had a falling out. Primarily, Gulen won't talk to the press. Gulen, you know, lives now in Pennsylvania. He won't talk to the press, but most of it believe despite the fact that Gulen is a devout Islamist, he's dedicated to Turkish democracy. And he doesn't like what Erdogan's authoritarian streak. There has been a falling out between the two of them, and that's what led Gulen to emigrate to the United States. But at least Erdogan accuses him of controlling a great number of judges and policemen who have been in his movement, which is called the Hizmet movement. In January, it was discovered, based on some media leaks that were put out on YouTube and some other social media sites, they discovered $4.5 million in cash in shoeboxes in the Interior Ministry's house, which led to the resignation of 3 of Erdogan's cabinet ministers. 2 of the sons of the ministers were indicted. And in addition, what Erdogan did when the scandal looked like the police were focusing too closely, he fired or moved 350 police officers and 80 judges, accusing them of being part of a foreign conspiracy guided by Mr. Gulen. It was uncovered this has been verified as his voice, again, of Erdogan talking to his son, telling him to get rid of some money that was in a mansion, and also some kickbacks over some construction in a neighborhood in Fatih, which is a neighborhood over by the Blue Mosque over on that side of Istanbul. Interestingly enough, the first thing Erdogan did is looking for allies in this. He started letting some of the generals and admirals out of jail that he'd thrown in jail 2 years ago over the Ergenekon Balyoz scandal. So, figuring that he needs the military right now to look more centrist, he's letting some of these folks out of jail. About 3 weeks ago, Berkan Elvan, who was a 15-year-old young man who was actually hit in the head by a tear gas canister last June. He was merely going to the store to get some bread. He was not even a protester. And he had been in a coma for 7 months. And he died. And he became the 8th victim from the previous June. 1 million people poured into the streets, not all just in Istanbul. They estimated 100,000 in Ankara, 100,000 in Izmir, probably 200,000 in Istanbul, filling the entire way, if you've been to Istanbul, from Taksim Square all the way down Istiklal for the funeral procession. Again, peaceful, but what you see is the government response to the funeral for young Mr. Elvan right there. Tear gas, rubber bullets, and in the funeral procession, a 9th protester died and another police officer died in the procession. So let's think about some of these issues, kind of in summary here. Erdogan does not have a majority in parliament to change the constitution, but he can pass laws at will. One of them he passed was allowing Ataturk's republic, remember, headscarves for women were not allowed in public schools or public buildings or in parliament. He passed a law allowing women members of parliament to wear a headscarf. they're showing you welcoming the young woman from AKP, first woman on the floor in Parliament wearing a headscarf. To members of the left, again, this was the demise of the secular republic. To people on the right, no, this is just religious freedom. This is not creeping Islamism. Interestingly enough, most of the women on either side of the party said, just get over it. And we should wear what we want, right? But again, to some, he's disguising creeping Islamism in the name of religious freedom. But remember, France does not allow headscarves in its public schools. Turkey's, this is not unique to the Middle East. France practices what we call aggressive secularism. In the United States, we do what is called passive secularism. But the idea that overt religious symbols aren't welcome in France either. I love this quote that, Turkish democracy is better than European democracy because he says we protect, our culture, we protect our things better. He said democracy is a train from which you get off once you reach the station. The idea that once I'm elected, I can kind of do whatever I want. Now, that runs counter to American ideals about democracy, where once the guy's elected, we go, are you kidding? Now we're going to go into the streets and protest whatever he's doing. Well, there is kind of a history. Ataturk kind of ruled by decree as well, but he was, for the good of the country, kind of a benevolent dictator. So Erdogan is not the first one to exhibit an authoritarian streak in Turkish politics. This is not new. But here's a very dangerous one. There are more journalists, and this is not per capita, there are more journalists in jail in Turkey than in China or Iran. If you say bad things about Erdogan, you're going to end up in jail. And this is not healthy for free speech. There's a new internet law that he got through, which allows him to shut down any site which he contends is a threat to personal privacy, pornography, a threat to national security. And we will see that he has used that most recently to some ill effect. There's a new alcohol law that was passed last summer. Again, kind of like the headscarves, is one of these, is kind of like gun control in America. It's a slippery slope, right? The alcohol law is no new liquor licenses are going to be issued within 100 meters of a mosque. Now, the ones that are existing are grandfathered. But there's a mosque about every 100 meters in Istanbul. So that basically means there are going to be no new liquor license. Also, you can't sell alcohol after 10 p.m. and before 5 a.m., I think. Now, for those of you that think it's a Muslim state and it doesn't have alcohol, you haven't been there. Alcohol is a very important part for a young man when he's going off for his draft service, he has a glass of rakı with his father. Rakı is a Turkish anise-based drink, and don't say it's like ouzo. Ouzo is like rakı. Okay, it's not the other way around. Be careful when you speak that way. And very interestingly, I told you there's a large group of centrist voters who, at least most scholars believe, kind of vote for Erdogan because of the economy. Well, for after 10 years of 5% growth, we're seeing some slowing. That overseas investment is not coming. Some of these construction projects, like is happening in a lot of the BRICS, in Brazil, are not being finished. What Turks, I don't know how what do we look at to gauge the economy? We look at the Dow Jones, we look at unemployment. If you're a Turk, you look at the exchange rate with the dollar. Because they've had problems of serious inflation. That's their measure of their economy. And right now, the lira is falling. And if the lira continues to fall, I contend that the voting for Erdogan will fall as well. But because of these voices exposing corruption on Twitter and on YouTube, these have led to a ban on YouTube and Twitter. The courts have recently overturned that, but he's tried to shut them down again, just in the last 2 weeks. And you can see the poster on the left of kind of Twitter getting on Erdogan's head. This is the quote that kind of scares me. Kind of finish here with, the mosques are our barracks, the domes are our helmets, the minarets are our bayonets, and the faithful are our soldiers. This is the kind of rhetoric that endears him to a great many of the 50% out in the villages, but doesn't endear him to the educated elite in the cities. And to some, this is not trying to find compromising ground. This is, to some, a kind of war of words. So is Erdogan finished? Well, the presidential elections are this summer. Erdogan is term limited. He can't be prime minister anymore. Turkey has both a prime minister and a president. We won't go into government, but right now there's talk of a Putin-Medvedev-like switch, where he will become president, his close AKP ally Abdullah Gül will become the prime minister, so he will be able to stay in power and run Turkey as the president rather than as the prime minister. I like that graffiti doesn't, it's a Turkcell, but you say the graffiti is AKP, which is Erdogan's party, with the heartbeat going to flatline. Most of the demonstrators would love to see that happen. I went a little long, but I hope I gave you enough background and hope a situation of what's going on with the Turkish democracy. I would love to answer your questions.
How much power does the current president have versus Erdogan?
Abdullah Gül is an interesting guy. He was the former foreign minister. He's a little smoother. He's not as rough around the edges. He speaks a little more accommodatingly. The young 15-year-old who died, Abdullah Gül went to visit the parents and express his condolences. Erdogan didn't say anything. You know, he called the protesters fakers. Erdogan did at the funeral. But Abdullah Gül's, again, a little more diplomatic, a little smoother. But the question is, he supports Erdogan. So most people believe that he will do what Erdogan tells him. But there's another undercurrent that says Abdullah Gül may step up and challenge Erdogan. And I'm not privy to enough political information to know which of those two scenarios will happen.
How long has Gül been president?
It's a 5-year term, I believe.
Next question's back here.
Sir.
For about a year prior to the breakout of these events in June, it appeared that Turkey was going through an economic renaissance of sorts, improving standard of living, stock and bond prices rising, currency also. That, of course, reversed about just a little less than a year ago, and took another downturn here again in January, as you know. Do you think that this spells, again, the flatlining of the heartbeat of this improving economy and standard of living there?
Well, as I remind my students, any prediction I make, I'm wrong 67.3% of the time. Again, I got to be careful. It's kind of like living in Boulder. You know, I don't know where the political center is in the United States when you live in Boulder. The people I hang out with in Turkey are not Erdogan supporters. You know, I don't hang out in the villages in Konya. So, but again, my perception is there's going to be a certain amount that are going to vote Islamists. There's a certain amount that vote left, but there is a group in the middle that are going to vote the economy. And the actual size of that block, I kind of put them in, you know, maybe 50, 25, 25, 50 being the Islamist right, or maybe 40. So if the economy, I think, goes south, I think AKP will go out the window with it. But he controls, and he and his cronies at least control a great deal of the wealth in Turkey right now. Now everyone, Republican, David Stockman wouldn't like this, but Republican, it appears that trickle down is happening in Turkey. That yes, the rich are getting really rich, but you are seeing the middle class, as you talk about, in the last 10 years has done quite well in Turkey.
Another question on this side.
Hi, I was over in Turkey in 2008. At that time, north of Taksim Square, as you go down towards the boat yards, off to the right, there's a large community of, I think, transplants from Europe that have never been repopulated into or brought into Turkey. And as I understand it, it's a group that the police are very alert to, and there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of displaced people there. And I was wondering, did that come up, or has that been resolved?
There is a Roma population in Istanbul. They are not that visible of late. You can see them. Turkey, Istanbul, I mean, again, for those of you that have been there, no, it's safer. I would feel safer in Istanbul than I would in New York or Chicago. I mean, it is a very safe city. But like any big city, there are pickpockets, there is crime, and this Roma element is one that you read in the guidebooks that contributed to that. But I don't think that large camp is there anymore. Again, there's probably a shopping mall there or a mosque now, because the development everywhere, there's a crane everywhere in Istanbul. I mean, it is growing like crazy. So if they exist, if they have on the edge of the Asian side, particularly the edge of what they call gece condos. Gece means night. Gece condos, this term for, some old Turkish law, if you can get it up overnight, then they got to get, takes a court order to get you out. So these gece condos show up on the outskirts of Istanbul where they put them up overnight in these barn raising parties.
I thought that the army was constitutionally required to protect secularism in
They are.
Turkey. Is that right? And since Erdogan has put the generals in jail, what is the army, is there any sense that the army is reacting to that, or?
Well,
Why?
of course, the people that I know, the old military colleagues from I talked about, again, think that Erdogan is the threat to the republic, and they would do it, but the political cloud of the military, but all these senior generals, and he's brought his own people in there, military people who support him to the highest post, their ability to threaten the presidency if it moves too far in one direction, or the prime minister, that they used to be able to do. Now, again, people used to say, well, you shouldn't be able to do that in a democracy. But again, the Turkish military saw themselves as a special role. Most of the military, I would say today, don't believe they have the power to do that right now. Because he also has increased the size of the gendarme, which is the federal police, which is a counter to the military also. That's me.
How is Turkey managing to deal with the Syrian refugees?
Well, that I haven't seen firsthand, so I only know what I've read in the paper. They used to have, initially they had the largest chunk of Syrian refugees, but now Jordan and Lebanon have as many as Turkey does. Turkey initially, Erdogan also, the Erdogan foreign policy is a whole nother thing. And when this broke out, Erdogan said, I know Assad, don't worry, I can deal with him. And he went down and talked to Assad, and basically Assad sent him packing. And then immediately, instead of someone who didn't want to see a Libya-like intervention in Syria, immediately began to call for a NATO intervention in Syria. He has been supporting not only refugees, but he's been training, along with Saudis and probably some CIA people, trading freedom fighters or anti-Assad rebels in southern Turkey. But there are hundreds of thousands of them down near Antakya. And they've also shot down 2 Syrian jets that have strayed over into Turkish airspace. But trying to stay kind of out of it, I guess, would be a better way to put it.
Regarding the election, is there likely to be just one opposition party, or how's the opposition organized?
There are 3 major opposition parties. Well, there are lots of parties. But the party of Ataturk is the CHP, California Highway Patrol. CHP, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, which means the Republican People's Party. They are the old party of Ataturk, the secular. It's hard to call them left or right because they don't quite match up to our left or right. But certainly they're not Islamist, and they're secular, but they have been pro-military, which you would think that would be right. Okay, but the CHP got, when Erdogan got 50, they got 25. In the most recent local elections, Erdogan came down to about 45, they went up to like 29. The next one is MHP, or MHP, which is the Nationalist People's Party, which is kind of a right-wing nationalist party, but not Islamist. And then there's the BDP, which is the Kurdish, kind of the political arm of the Kurdish Workers' Party, which largely represents the Kurds of southeastern Turkey. And I think in parliament right now it's about 49, 25, 20, and 18. And there are a couple of smaller ones, I can't remember, that get 1 or 2%. I mean, clearly if the opposition could unite, they could do something about AKP, but as you can see, they're running about a 10% advantage over any of the opposition parties. So unless they could all come together, they all agree they don't like Erdogan, but that's all they agree on. They don't come together on anything else.
Is he in a coalition in Parliament, or do they have...
Right now, because the way it works is, this is comparative politics 101, all the seats, they're divided up by the percentages you get, but there's always some leftover percentages by people who don't reach that basic threshold. And even though he only got 49% of the vote, he's got 51% of the seats. So he's not in a coalition for the first time, and that's what allows him to pass the alcohol law and the headscarf law and some of that.
Another question here.
Yes, ma'am.
How does the gentleman who's living in Pennsylvania maintain his following in Turkey while he's living in Pennsylvania?
Twitter?
Yeah.
I can't answer that. I mean, I would guess in this day and age, the head of the PKK is in a Turkish jail. So, I mean, the head of the Kurdish Workers' Party is kind of leading the Kurdish separatist movement from jail. I'm pretty sure you could lead this movement from Pennsylvania. But I'm sorry, I really can't, I don't know how he's doing it, Ben. But what I don't know enough to know that Erdogan's accusation that all these opponents are Gulen followers, if that's really true. Clearly there were people that were part of that movement, but this may be Erdogan's rhetoric. That in fact these people may not in fact be connected to Gulen. It's just Erdogan painting all of these former supporters who are now not necessarily in favor of him as all Gulen supporters to make it look like a foreign conspiracy.
Question right in the center.
How are other religious groups treated in Turkey, i.e. Christians and Jews, and are they vocal?
Turks take great pride. There's a couple of neighborhoods in Istanbul, one on the Asian side and one in Fatih, where there is a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, like right in the same spot. In our neighborhood, there's a synagogue. You can see it from our balcony. You look down, there's a synagogue. However, it is fenced off with barbed wire, and there's a guy checking. But, you know, they do that in synagogues here. So, I mean, that's not unique to Istanbul. So, most of the Turks I know are very proud. Again, I'm talking about the secular elite, and the business people are very proud of the fact that they think they're incredibly religiously tolerant. And I would say out in the countryside, at least in the tourist areas, but I can't tell you in Konya where 100% of the women wear headscarves if they're equally tolerant. But I would say in general, this is not Saudi Arabia. This is not, you know, there is a large, again, 2% is not Muslim. That's not very much. But most of that 2% exists in either Istanbul or Izmir. So it's not out in the countryside.
Another question.
The Greek Orthodox Archbishop, of course, the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, where is his home? Istanbul. He's still there, and he's not leaving. So, and he's allowed to stay there, and you know, that sort of thing.
Next question's also in the center.
It sounds like to me that as you ratcheted up the numbers, talking about the protests, that it started out with, say, a young group, and that it was at the funeral where suddenly it went sort of viral to 1 million people.
Well, it started with the trees.
Okay,
This
the
small group, yeah.
trees, the people, yeah. But has it sort of broken into the status quo, or is the middle class joining in it? Are the parents joining in?
It's a
Has it
wonderful
gone
story.
beyond the youth?
One of the Erdogan's speeches, and again, he doesn't sugarcoat anything. He got on TV one night, this was by mothers, come get your children in Taksim Square and bring them home. The next day they interviewed, we can't because we're here. You know, they interviewed all these mothers who were in the square saying, no, we can't. But the Lawyers Association of Istanbul came en masse to Taksim one day to demonstrate in support of the protesters. And I told you, the young women I was in school with, their husbands who were young professionals, most of them who they met in Europe, you know, went to their jobs every day, and what did they do at night? They went to Taksim, they went to the park and stayed there all night. And then when the festival was over and it was fighting every night, they did the same thing. They went and tried to march back into the square every night. So yes, it started with youth, and certainly it has a younger bias, but no, it is definitely middle class. It represents a broad cross-section of Istanbul.
Doesn't the U.S. have a fairly big military presence in Turkey?
Not anymore.
What's the base there?
There's a base at Incirlik. I mean, compared to when I was a kid, there were some 13 bases, and I went to high school there. We had 1,000 kids in the high school, American kids. Today, there are 2 NATO bases at Incirlik, and then there's a headquarters in Izmir. All the listing posts all along the Soviet border and along the Black Sea are gone. The big listing post at Karamürsel, all of the things in Ankara. There were 3 different bases in the capital in Ankara. They're gone. So in Izmir, there's a small NATO headquarters and then the air base at Incirlik. But by comparison, even in the 60s, Incirlik is smaller. Now it's a joint Turkish NATO base. And as you know, we wanted to surge for the Iraq War out of there, and Erdogan turned W down to allow that to happen, which, you know, was part of the kind of independent foreign policy streak. But again, it wasn't in Turkish interest to do that, I don't think. But that's another issue. Yeah.
Just one follow-up question. What's the U.S. relationship with Turkey right now?
Well, you saw the picture. There was a very, before all this happened, Erdogan came to Washington. Obama gave him the ultimate state visit and paid him all the compliments of this democratic leader in the Middle East, this Islamic democratic leader, model for the Arab Spring. And of course, all the Turks think that Obama did this, propped him up, made Erdogan more popular. We never should have done this. But the rhetoric is toned down. I would say, certainly we look at him as still an ally, but we have said most recently, there were comments by the State Department about Twitter and about YouTube and about the crackdowns, all these things like, gee, you shouldn't be doing this, but nothing should, no sanctions, no nasty things happening, that sort of thing.
Thank you. We've gone over a little bit tonight, but we'll take just one more question, our last question here. Thank you.
What is the relationship with Turkey and Greece?
It's interesting. I mean, I told you that the Greeks aren't opposed to Turkey joining the EU, it's Cyprus. If you've been to both, you know the Turkish food and the Greek food are the same. Okay, the alcohol, rakı, ouzo, it's the same. I mean, their cultures, obviously, because of where they it used to be before the War of Independence when 1 million Greeks were kicked out, but of course, guess how that got started? Greece invaded Turkey, so, I mean, they lived intermingled. And so, that causes some friction. But to this day, I would say it's very interesting. I have a friend who, I'll cut this short sea story. He has a house out on this island, and there's a boarded up house. This is a beautiful island called the Princess Islands out in Sea Marmara. And they have kind of a little cottage, and right below them is a boarded up house. Now, this is on a resort island. This piece of property must be worth, I'm going, why didn't somebody sell that? Yeah, that's Greek. How long has it been that way? Oh, 40 or 50 years. Because it belongs to an absentee Greek landlord who left, and Turkish law will not take that over. So they're still there. And I would say relations, there's fighting right now over the oil possibility in the Aegean, and they wave the flag over the islands out there. But I think, NATO has always kept them reasonably close. And other than, they never really fired a shot in anger. In '74, Turkey fought Greek Cypriots. They didn't fight Greece. Although they thought Greece was going to enter the war, but they didn't. So I think it's more cordial than people think.
Please help me in thanking Dr. Young for this evening.
Thank you.